In the heart of Europe, during the summer of 1944, Warsaw became the stage of one of the most profound struggles of the Second World War. The uprising against occupation was a moment when ordinary citizens took extraordinary risks, facing overwhelming force with little more than conviction, improvised tools, and shared determination. Black and white imagery frames this story. Narrow, cobbled streets, plain coats concealing folded armbands, and dim stairwells where whispered discussions seemed to shape uncertain plans. The official record often describes these actions as spontaneous or purely defensive, yet subtle traces in surviving documents suggest a deeper complexity. Dates stamped out of sequence and annotations scribbled in margins raise questions about how the events were recorded and why. For those who lived through it, the uprising was not only a clash of arms, but also a confrontation with bureaucratic silence, where their lives were reduced to entries in files and clipped reports. The atmosphere of occupied Warsaw, tense and watchful, speaks to a fragile balance between order and collapse. From this opening moment, the story expands into institutional corridors, where documents were filed and refilled, reference numbers shifted, and narratives shaped. It moves outward to international halls, where distant decisions weighed heavily upon those waiting in crowded streets and train platforms. And it leads finally into the realm of memory, where what is preserved in ink may not fully capture what was lived in shadow. This is the path we now begin to explore, step by step, through the monochrome echoes of a divided city. Chapter 1. Whispers, beneath occupied streets of the city. Summer of 1944 opens under a heavy sky over the city. Narrow streets appear in monochrome, wet cobbles reflecting muted light. A plain civilian coat conceals a folded armband in a close-up portrait of hands. People move in small groups, heads down, avoiding open conversation in public squares. A wide, archival crowd shot shows market stalls emptied of laughter for long days. A mid-shot of a dim stairwell captures hushed meetings in cramped domestic rooms. An exterior train platform appears repeatedly, travelers waiting with uncertain faces and small bundles. The mood is tense, but orderly, as if restraint became a daily habit. Official accounts often describe these moments as defensive measures to protect civilians. Alternative readings suggest a more coordinated network of local plans in private spaces. The record may not fully capture that distinction, and small discrepancies appear in surviving papers. A file stamp on one document appears out of sequence with adjacent entries. Handwritten annotations in margins sometimes conflict with later, typed summaries, indicating revision or omission. These two indicators sit quietly beside stacks of folded memoranda and clipped newspaper headers. Uniform lapels caught in doorway light show generic dress and rank, not personal identity. Conversations reported in later interviews often seem summarized into bureaucratic language. That language may flatten nuance and obscure motives that were more varied on the ground. Neighbors shared food, exchanged messages, and learned signals for movement. Children wore familiar coats and followed adults through alleys, learning caution as routine. In many frames, faces show exhaustion rather than rage. People appear to act to protect neighborhoods and homes more than to pursue grand strategy. Yet gestures of coordination, such as simultaneous preparations across districts, suggest links beyond spontaneous reaction. Some orders in local records read like prepared instructions rather than on-the-spot decisions. At the same time, public proclamations often emphasize spontaneity, perhaps to frame events within acceptable political lines. That framing could serve presentational needs and also shape later archival practices. In the quiet rooms where plans formed, folded memoranda passed from hand to hand. The papers are worn at the edges and sometimes bear finger smudges into the ink. A close-up of a memorandum on a table shows corrections in pencil and faint erasures. Those marginal marks appear to indicate rapid amendment during stressful days. They also suggest reliance on oral orders later translated into written form. Official minutes might prioritize formal dates and signatures. Those formal entries might not account for hurried amendments recorded separately. The file stamp motif returns on many envelopes, a repetitive mark of institutional control. But the stamp does not always align with the chronology implied by contemporaneous notes. Observers reading the archive may notice these mismatches and question the sequence recorded in official volumes. Such questions do not prove deliberate distortion, but they do suggest complexity in how events were processed. Witness accounts and family papers often fill gaps left by institutional records. Small photographs kept in personal albums show informal gatherings that never reached formal files. These candid portraits provide texture where official copies offer only summaries. They also show clothing styles, such as plain uniforms and civilian coats, worn interchangeably by the same figures. That interchange suggests blurred boundaries between formal authority and civilian initiative. Movement through the city relied on ordinary infrastructure like trams and freight cars. Exterior transport shots in monochrome underline how daily routines continued amid tension. People used trains and platforms to relocate, to deliver messages, and to carry supplies. The recurring motif of the train platform connects private departure with public consequence. Those platforms later appear in official logs as simple transit points. Personal papers often describe them differently, as moments of decision or quiet farewells. That difference between institutional record and lived memory may reflect the constraints of filing systems. Institutions favored succinct entries and numbered references. Private notes favored description and emotion. The contrast between these forms of record shapes how later readers understand events. In some instances, a stamped directive seems to arrive in archives days after an action was recorded elsewhere. Those inconsistent stamped dates complicate attempts to trace clear lines of command. At the same time, marginal notes often indicate who first raised particular options. These annotations provide clues about initiative and local leadership. They also show that written records were living documents, changed as events developed. The documents and photographs together create a layered image of the city. Close-up images of folded memoranda alternate with wide shots of square and boulevard. Mid-shots of official desks sit beside candid portraits of families sharing bread. The repetition of the file stamp motif ties these images to institutional memory. Yet the human scenes remind us that paperwork was one part of a larger human process. People organized kitchens, improvised shelters, and tended to each other under difficult circumstances. Clothing remained simple and functional, with plain coats and basic uniforms predominating. Those garments carried social meaning, but not always formal rank. In public accounts, leaders appear to instruct from elevated positions. In private notes, many decisions seem to emerge from street-level committees and neighborhood networks. The tension between those levels appears without dramatic assertion in the papers and images. It appears instead as small discrepancies and overlapping references. For example, a reference number may shift when a report moves between offices, suggesting administrative reclassification. That change alone does not prove concealment, but it does indicate administrative complexity that can obscure responsibility. In the alleys and courtyards, people improvised signals and routines to reduce risk. They formed patrols to watch corners and to sound alarms if necessary. These behaviors are described in personal diaries and oral recollections with modest, practical language. The diaries emphasize routines over heroic spectacle. They also show how ordinary acts of care became acts of defiance. Children learned these routines early, and adults taught them patiently. The imagery of small hands folding papers and tucking messages further humanizes the record. Those small acts of care are visible in several candid photographs. Each image contributes to a composite sense of a city under strain but not under surrender. The official narrative tends toward clear lines and tidy motives. Alternative readings emphasize overlapping authorities and communal improvisation. Both perspectives offer partial truths about what unfolded in the streets. When the archive contains marginal annotations and mismatched dates, it invites careful interpretation rather than immediate judgment. The goal of reading these sources becomes to reconstruct human choices and institutional constraints together. That reconstruction must consider how ordinary people navigated a world where public statements and private practices differed. It must also consider how file stamps and folded memoranda shaped later memory. Looking beyond the streets, these local patterns hint at larger institutional dynamics. The next chapter follows those documents inward into offices and corridors, where records were shaped and reshaped. There, the human traces encountered in neighborhoods meet formal registers and numbered files, and those encounters deepen questions about how the past was recorded and remembered. Chapter 2. Papers filed in silence. And memory inside. Tall archive rooms where light falls through dusty panes, stacks of folders form silent walls around narrow aisles. A clipped newspaper header sits on a wooden bench near a folded memorandum. File stamps repeat like a steady heartbeat across envelopes and covers. Bureaucratic language occupies neat typewritten pages that often replace lived detail with calm phrasing. Officials recorded actions in registers meant to make events legible across offices. Yet those registers sometimes bend beneath the pressure of haste and confusion. One folder shows an inconsistent stamped date that does not match a contemporaneous note nearby. Another report carries small changes to reference numbers as it moved between registries, suggesting reclassification or later consolidation. These two indicators do not resolve intent, but they do complicate efforts to read a single, straightforward timeline. Close-up shots of ledger margins reveal faint pencil annotations, small edits made after an event. A mid-shot of a desk shows a plain uniform jacket folded over a chair. Nearby rests a stack of folded memoranda, corners soft from handling. The materiality of these objects matters. Finger smudges on envelopes and creased edges on orders speak to repeated consultation and to improvisation under pressure. Typewritten. Directives often seem formal and unyielding. Handwritten notes at the margins appear urgent and adaptive. That contrast yields a layered archival voice. In some passages, paperwork records clear chains of signatories and dates. In others, entries jump without obvious explanation. The gap between formal entries and marginalia creates space for alternative readings that might reflect local initiative rather than centralized command. Institutional registers may emphasize continuity and control. Marginal annotations sometimes suggest the opposite, local actors adjusting plans on the fly. The rhythm of filing practices shaped how the past was made legible. Officers in plain uniforms delivered reports between department doors. Clerks stamped documents with the same stamp repeatedly. The repeated impression of the file stamp becomes a motif that anchors the record. Yet stamps alone cannot confirm the precise moment an instruction was formed or acted upon. Researchers who follow these marks often find sequences that challenge tidy narratives. Where a stamped date follows an action recorded elsewhere, questions arise about transmission and delay. When reference numbers change midstream, readers must ask whether the change tracked a bureaucratic reorganization or a deliberate reframing. The files also carry traces of personal concern. Margin notes sometimes bear initials and short reminders to consult individuals. Those small directives imply conversation and negotiation away from formal registers. A midshot of a closed ledger near a window suggests the institutional distance from street life. But small personal packets tucked inside folders pull the story back toward neighborhoods and kitchens. Letters written on cheap paper accompany official copies in many envelopes. The handwriting in those sheets is often quick and direct. It records shortages, movements, and questions not visible in typed summaries. These personal texts offer human scale against the broader language of policy. They reveal how communities tried to communicate needs to a system built for order. When a folded memorandum bears both typed instruction and a penciled correction, it suggests a cycle of command and local response. Documents sometimes moved in layers, passed from hand to hand before receiving formal registration. Those movements mattered for timing and for perception. A delayed stamp could mean a delay in action. It could also mean administrative backlog under extreme conditions. Both possibilities alter how historians reconstruct responsibility. Photographs accompany many records. Archival portraits in monochrome show groups posed in town squares and families gathered in domestic rooms. An exterior transport shot of a train platform appears in several folders, each time with different notes attached. The platform serves as a repeated emblem of departure and arrival, of rumor carried along tracks, and of messages ferried between districts. The visual recurrence of the platform ties logistical detail to human choice. It also highlights how documents moved along physical routes before reaching offices. The circulation of reports followed everyday infrastructure. That circulation influenced which voices reached decision points and which remained at the margins. The formal archive privileges signed directives and numbered files. Informal exchanges, verbal confirmations, and neighborhood memos often left smaller traces. When those traces survive, they are sometimes appended awkwardly to formal files. That awkwardness tells a story about uneven documentation. Institutional memory may therefore appear cohesive in printed volumes while still containing internal contradictions. These contradictions are not always evidence of malfeasance. They may instead indicate the complexity of coordination under extreme stress. Yet they also show how some accounts could be emphasized while others receded. The shaping of narrative through administrative practice has consequences for memory. Public statements later reference the compiled records. Those compilations might gloss over irregularities in the heat of crisis. They might prioritize continuity over messy reality. In office photographs, plain coats hang beside nameplates and typed directories. The juxtaposition of human clothing and impersonal signage captures a tension between people and systems. Policymakers reading bound volumes years later encountered this same tension. They saw orders and responses, but they often lacked the texture, preserved in marginal notes and personal letters. That loss can affect how responsibility is assigned. When the archive bears a changed reference number, later interpreters must ask whether the change reflects administrative housekeeping or deeper redescription. The answer matters for institutional accountability and for the memory of those affected on the ground. File layouts and cataloging systems shaped accessibility. Some boxes were sealed and later opened in different administrative contexts. Others were cataloged under neutral headings that obscured local significance. Those cataloging choices impact what researchers encounter first and what they find only with deeper inquiry. The order of materials becomes itself a kind of narrative framing. This framing interacts with broader political pressures present at the time. Officials balancing security concerns and public communication sometimes favored concise, impersonal phrasing. That language could smooth divisions for public consumption. Conversely, personal notes and marginal comments often recorded debate, hesitation, and urgent problem-solving. The coexistence of those registers underlines how state action and personal experience diverged in practice. Across many files, the motif of the folded memorandum repeats. The memo appears as a practical object and as a symbol of incomplete transmission. In some cases, a folded memorandum bears both a stamped directive and a later handwritten note that reorders priorities. Those layered markings suggest negotiation rather than simple submission. The archive, therefore, preserves both instruction and contest. Reading these documents requires attention to both kinds of mark. It requires listening for the quieter voice in margins and the louder voice in type. The outcome of that listening affects how memory is produced and how policy lessons are drawn. When archives are used decades later to make claims about leadership and responsibility, the unevenness of record-keeping can complicate neat conclusions. It can also enrich understanding of how communities navigated circumstances where paperwork and human action coexisted imperfectly. As documents leave the confined spaces of registries, the next chapter traces how institutional decisions reached broader diplomatic spheres and how international responses intersected with what was written here. The move outward from sealed boxes to foreign tables expands the frame, but it keeps the file stamp as a reminder of how the act of recording shaped what later history could know. Chapter 3: Institutions Under Strain. And watch-tall stone staircases lead into corridors that carry the weight of record and decision. Rows of chairs sit empty in lobby spaces, waiting for officials who moved in measured steps. A mid-shot of a ledger reveals neat columns, typed entries, and occasional pencil corrections. A close-up of a uniform lapel shows worn cloth and a simple rank pin caught in light. The file stamp motif repeats across envelopes and on the edges of folded memoranda kept in stacks. Officials in plain coats pass documents between closed doors and locked rooms. Those movements may appear orderly on paper and routine in appearance. Yet the daily rhythm of paperwork often bent under pressure and urgent need. Typewritten directives arrived with formal language and formal signatures. Handwritten marginal notes, sometimes rewritten later, appear faint against typed lines. An inconsistent stamped date shows up on one directive, offset from the sequence in a related register. A change in reference numbers appears as reports moved between offices, suggesting reclassification. Those two modest indicators do not prove intent, but they complicate a straightforward reading. Institutional procedures could delay action by design or by overload. Clerks prioritized entries according to office rules that might not match local urgencies. Where a folded memorandum crossed multiple desks, it could gain new instructions or lose earlier clarity. That process may have altered how responsibilities were recorded. Within these halls, uncertainty shaped choices as much as policy did. Decisions written at a desk might not reach neighborhoods quickly. Messages routed through formal channels often arrived later than improvised notes passed by hand. The contrast between formal registers and oral practice appears frequently in surviving files. An official summary might describe a course of action in calm terms. A marginal note written in hurried script might indicate practical complications and immediate resource needs. Those annotations suggest negotiation and adaptation rather than simple obedience. Institutional actors often balanced competing priorities under strain. Security concerns, logistical constraints, and political calculations intersected in meetings that left sparse minutes. Some meetings produced clear directives that moved through the file system. Others generated informal understandings that survived only in personal correspondence. These private texts often accompanied formal entries inside archived folders. A mid-shot of a desk shows both types of paper stacked together. Material traces like smudged fingerprints and worn corners testify to repeated consultation. That materiality matters for historians and for memory. When a stamped envelope bears a later date than an attached letter, readers must ask whether the delay reflects administrative backlogs or deliberate timing. When reference numbers shift, they may mark routine reclassification. They may also indicate an attempt to assimilate inconvenient facts into a different bureaucratic frame. Either possibility alters how responsibility is perceived years later. Officials who relied on established filing practices could assume those practices preserved a faithful record. But the act of filing itself shaped what the records emphasized and what they left out. Boxes cataloged under neutral headings often hid the urgency within. Cataloging choices redirected attention away from local voices and toward institutional narratives. Photographs in the archive amplify that contrast. Wide interior shots show polished halls and formal signage. Close-up portraits on personal. Sheets show individuals in plain coats and tired expressions. Those images sit beside folded memoranda and clipped newspaper headers. The recurring motif of the train platform connects institutional decisions to public movement. Platforms appear in official movement logs and in personal postcards. That shared imagery links the routes that carried reports to the routes that carried people. When institutional nodes failed to interpret local signals, consequences reached into neighborhoods. Food distributions could be delayed. Requests for shelter might remain in unprocessed folders. Families waiting at platforms sometimes left with only rumor and partial information. The human cost lived primarily in these everyday failures of transmission and timing. At the same time, institutions provided order and resources when they functioned as designed. Hospitals, civil offices, and relief centers used registers to allocate scarce supplies. Formal directives guided the distribution of services to those who reached official centers. That dual character of institutions, both enabling and constraining, defines the archival record. It also complicates any simple judgment about administrative performance. Archival silence can itself be telling. Empty boxes and missing volumes point to disruption, loss, or purposeful omission. Where records are sparse, oral accounts and family papers often fill gaps. Those sources provide texture and emotional detail absent from typewritten summaries. They describe how people organized kitchens, located shelters, and negotiated access to basic needs. These accounts reveal the lived consequences of institutional lag. At the same time, oral recollections may vary in detail and in emphasis. Memory and paperwork therefore interact in complex ways. Institutional language often sought to present events in coherent sequences. That coherence may have been a practical necessity for governance and for later historical accounting. But it might also smooth over contested lines of authority and the messy results of hurried decisions. Marginal annotations and changed numbers invite readers to probe those seams. They show a record that evolved as circumstances evolved. They suggest that the archive is composed of layered voices rather than a single authoritative script. Officials recorded what they could, when they could, and sometimes as they wished to present it. Clerks and junior staff added corrections, and notes that reveal negotiation rather than uniform command. These acts of correction and annotation are part of the institutional story. They show how paper became a medium for both instruction and debate. When documents traveled beyond local offices, they entered diplomatic channels and higher-level registers. That upward movement reshaped priorities and sometimes reframed local urgency. Foreign desks and international tables considered reports as part of broader calculations. Those calculations may have prioritized strategic concerns over immediate humanitarian needs. The transfer of information across borders and hierarchies therefore had policy consequences on the ground. Officials in plain coats, who once delivered parcels and letters, found their efforts reframed at a distance. The archived record records those translations imperfectly. Where entries shifted reference numbers or bore inconsistent dates, the institutional trail became harder to follow. That opacity can impede accountability and can complicate memory for later generations. Researchers must therefore treat the archive with care. Attention to marginalia, to material evidence like smudges, and to the sequence of stamps yields a more textured understanding. It reveals institutions as human constructions, subject to error, fatigue, and imperfect communication. The consequence of such imperfections was not merely administrative. They shaped which needs were met and which were deferred. They shaped who received timely assistance and who remained waiting on platforms. They shaped how later narratives constructed responsibility and heroism. Understanding these processes requires listening to both the printed record and the quieter annotations beside it. It requires considering how file stamps and folded memoranda shaped memory as much as they recorded action. The next chapter widens. This view toward international forums and distant tables where decisions shaped by these files met foreign restraint and diplomatic calculation. Chapter 4. Shadows across international decision-making tables. The frame opens on distant capitals and quiet ministry interiors in monochrome tones. Delegates sit in polished rooms, hands folded, papers arranged in deliberate stacks. Telegram. Slips and folded memoranda appear on lacquered tables next to clipped newspaper headers. An exterior train platform returns in several scenes, linking local routes to diplomatic corridors. Officials in plain coats exchange brief notes before meetings begin. The official record often presents coordinated policy and cautious support for stability. Alternative readings suggest measured restraint by distant actors who balanced multiple priorities. Evidence in the archive sometimes complicates clear narratives of timely aid and direct intervention. A telegram page bears a stamped date that does not match the recorded arrival date, indicating delay or administrative lag. Reference numbers shift as reports move between foreign desks and embassy lines, suggesting reclassification or later. Consolidation. These two indicators invite questions about how reports were prioritized and transmitted. Wide shots of capital streets show crowds and normal commerce, while mid-shots of ministry lobbies reveal a different tempo. Documents labeled for review cite beside personal notes describing shortages and urgent requests. The contrast between polished protocol and ragged human need appears repeatedly. Formal minutes often use restrained language and cautious verbs. They frame decisions as part of broader strategy and allied consideration. Margin notes, by contrast, record immediacy and moral unease in compact script. Those annotations suggest informal debate and the recognition of pressing humanitarian consequences. In several cases, diplomatic correspondence seems attentive to political optics more than to immediate relief logistics. That emphasis might reflect long-term strategic calculations rather than callous neglect. At the same time, diplomatic actors faced real constraints. Supply lines, military priorities, and competing theaters of conflict shaped what was possible. The documents show deliberation about risk and consequence. They reflect a tension between public rhetoric and private appraisal. Photographs of consular offices show clerks stamping envelopes and sorting reports. The file stamp motif appears on dispatches destined for foreign ministers and on replies returned months later. Folded memoranda from local committees arrive at distant desks with notes attached. Those notes sometimes reframe the original reports, emphasizing different priorities or downgrading urgent appeals. That reframing might be bureaucratic housekeeping. It might also indicate a decision to shape the narrative for wider audiences. The imagery suggests that information often lost fidelity while traveling across administrative layers. Train platforms and freight carriages served as arteries for messages and personnel. Files and people moved along the same rails but at different speeds. The platform motif links the intimate movement of letters to the broader transit of policy. In one sequence, a dispatch describing neighborhood needs is archived beneath a broader regional assessment. That placement might reduce its visibility for decision-makers. Alternatively, it may reflect an effort to integrate local reports into a wider operational picture. The ambiguity persists in the paper trail. International tables hosted discussions about legal status, territorial claims, and the optics of engagement. Public statements emphasize diplomatic caution and careful alignment. Behind closed doors, some delegates expressed moral concern and frustration at limited capacity. Marginal annotations on certain cables reveal these tensions in terse phrasing. They show moments when urgency pressed against protocol. The archive also contains records of third-party actors offering assistance. Those offers appear in clipped telegrams and brief letters, sometimes lacking logistical follow-through. The archival record may therefore contain both intention and failed execution. When offers of aid did not translate into material support, consequences returned to streets and platforms in the city. The human scale of those consequences emerges in appended personal letters and family notes within diplomatic folders. They describe delayed supplies and uncertain passage for those seeking refuge. The contrast between parchment registers and folded civilian notes underscores how bureaucratic distance can obscure lived experience. Visual sequences alternate between polished halls and candid portraits of refugees and volunteers. Those portraits show plain civilian coats and tired faces rather than official identifiers. They humanize entries that otherwise appear as technical. Reports. Diplomatic communication often sought to manage political risk. That management could mean delaying decisive statements until Allied positions aligned. Such delays might have strategic logic. They might also have real costs for civilians waiting in precarious urban neighborhoods. The archival indicators of inconsistent stamped dates and changing reference numbers point to moments where timing and categorization altered outcomes. They suggest that the temporal order of events sometimes diverged across layers of communication. That divergence complicates simple narratives of causality. It asks historians to account for latency as a factor in decision-making. The documents also show occasional attempts at coordination. Several memoranda describe proposed channels of supply and suggested safe corridors. Those proposals sometimes met bureaucratic approval, yet logistical obstacles prevented immediate implementation. Where approvals lagged, local committees improvised and adapted. Their improvisations appear in appended notes and in personal correspondence preserved alongside formal files. That coexistence of strategy and improvisation shapes how responsibility is understood. The international record reflects both solidarity and constraint. It includes appeals for recognition and for resources, as well as cautionary advisories about escalation. Public communications prioritize diplomatic neutrality and long-term relationships. Private notes recorded ethical discomfort and pressure. To act. The tension between those registers persists throughout the archive. Photographs of foreign delegations arriving in capitals show polished attire and formal greetings. They contrast with images of crowded train platforms where departures looked uncertain and hurried. The recurring motifs of file stamp, folded, memorandum, and train platform tie these scenes together. They remind the viewer that documents and people moved through connected networks with differing speeds. When a reference number changes across a chain of custody, the act of reclassification can shift responsibility. When a stamped date lags behind an action, the lag may affect public perception and recorded timelines. These procedural details matter for how events were later remembered and narrated. The archival record also reveals selective emphasis in coverage. Clipped newspaper headers included in diplomatic packets highlight international commentary. Those clippings sometimes frame local events through broader political lenses. That framing may have influenced which aspects of the crisis gained attention abroad. It may also have tilted responses toward symbolic gestures rather than direct assistance. At the same time, some diplomatic actors did press for tangible support. Records show moments of pragmatic agreement to facilitate aid, though execution remained uneven. The interplay of rhetoric and logistics reappears as a central theme. The material traces left on paper, smudged fingerprints, and hurried marginal notes offer clues about human urgency within formal systems. They show that bureaucratic formality did not erase the immediacy of suffering. Instead, it translated that immediacy into different languages of record and response. As documents left foreign tables and returned with qualifications, the local implications multiplied. Requests for help might be reformatted, delayed, or deprioritized. Each procedural alteration affected real lives waiting at platforms and in neighborhoods. The chapter closes with the sense that international tables were arenas of both compassion and constraint. They carried the power to help and the capacity to delay. That duality shaped outcomes on the ground and left a mixed archive. The next chapter moves back inward to how memory and commemoration absorbed these layered experiences and how official archives and private recollections continue to negotiate meaning. Chapter 5. Memory Bound. In black ink, final sequences dwell on public markers and private pages, rendered across monochrome frames that hold both clarity and blur. Close-up portraits of survivors in plain coats sit beside wide shots of commemorative plaques arrayed along familiar streets. A mid-shot of a folded memorandum rests on a wooden lectern where speeches have been delivered, its corners softened from handling. The recurring motif of the file stamp returns in archival trays and on display cases in museum rooms. These visual threads connect personal albums to institutional displays, and they bind memory to material. Official commemorations often present a structured account that highlights sacrifice and resilience. Alternative readings may emphasize omission, contested emphasis, or selective framing. That contrast appears as small archival anomalies that invite scrutiny. One photograph bears a caption that conflicts with its printed year, suggesting a mismatch between image and label. A stamped date on an enclosure does not align with a linked text, indicating a temporal disconnect inside the boxes. These modest indicators do not settle all questions, but they complicate tidy narratives and signal the archive's active role in shaping remembrance. Commemorative ceremonies follow familiar rhythms. Flags are folded and placed respectfully. Voices speak in measured tones. Wreaths are laid on pavement that still remembers footsteps. Such rituals make collective grief legible across generations. At the same time, family papers and oral testimonies offer different registers. Personal diaries keep the day-to-day texture of life and loss. Letters record errands, the names of missing neighbors, and practical requests that never found formal answers. These private traces sometimes arrive in official repositories as annexes to formal files. When they do, their tone may stand in contrast to institutional phrasing. Institutional registers favor succinct entries and numbered references. Family archives preserve names, gestures, and domestic routines. The coexistence of these forms of memory shapes public understanding. Museums and educational curricula often draw on curated selections from the archive. The choices made by curators and educators determine which images and documents travel into classrooms and public consciousness. That selection process might reflect scholarly consensus and professional judgment. It might also reflect broader political choices about which stories to foreground. Decisions about exhibit order, caption wording, and document emphasis influence how later generations interpret events. Public plaques and official histories can stabilize a narrative, but they can also occlude competing experiences. Where captions smooth complexity, oral testimony pushes back with texture and contradiction. Veterans' portraits in plain uniform lapels appear in display cases alongside anonymous civic photographs. Those portraits humanize institutional accounts, but do not resolve questions about decision-making at higher levels. Memory practices also carry policy implications. Official recognition or omission guides grant-making and commemorative funding. Which records are digitized, restored, or left in boxes matters for access. Communities with robust archival representation may see their narratives preserved and taught. Communities left underdocumented may struggle to claim space in public memory. Archivists' cataloging choices, then, have practical consequences beyond scholarship. The politics of memory extend to legal and social repair. Claims for restitution, for public acknowledgement, and for educational inclusion rely on traces in paper and photograph. When reference numbers change or when captions diverge from photographic content, legal arguments can become more complicated. Researchers and practitioners must therefore weigh documentary ambiguity carefully, understanding both the limits and the value of surviving records. Memory is not only preserved in institutions, it lives in streets, in family meals, and in the gestures of remembrance passed down across households. Photographs kept in albums show children learning silence as a social skill. They show neighbors gathering to make common meals where resources permitted. Those images remind us that daily life and ceremonial memory coexist within households and communities. The train platform motif links departure and return, linking private farewells to public rituals. platforms become stages for both partings and later commemorations. People who once waited there for uncertain journeys later return for memorial services. The material traces of those movements appear in official itineraries and in marginal notes tucked into correspondence. The visual repetition of folded memoranda and file stamps ties civic practice to state practice. In some cases, institutional memorials attempt closure through narrative framing. They may set a chronology, assign roles, and present an arc from crisis to recovery. Such framing can offer solace and civic continuity. It can also reduce complexity by emphasizing tidy lines of cause and effect. Alternative readings highlight how stories were contested at the time and how they remain contested now. Memory practices may reflect compromise as much as consensus. Across decades, political priorities shift and institutional emphases change. Exhibitions once framed in one way may be reinterpreted or relocated in later years. New documents may surface that complicate earlier narratives. Oral testimonies recorded later can add richness but also reveal divergence in recollection. That divergence does not diminish value. It enriches understanding by showing plurality of experience. The archive itself is active in this process. Boxes are recatalogued. Files migrate between departments. Some records are restored carefully, while others fray in storage. These material processes determine which voices become prominent and which remain quieter. The presence or absence of preservation matters profoundly. When a file stamp appears repeatedly on important correspondence, researchers take note of recurrent administrative attention. When a caption or date fails to align, they take note of the possibility of later intervention. These are small clues that shape interpretation without delivering simple verdicts. Memory binds law and culture. Scholarship and pedagogy. Public recognition can create new rituals and new obligations. Educational syllabi that include contested episodes influence how future citizens understand both risk and responsibility. Commemoration shapes civic identity by creating emblematic moments around which narratives cohere. Those emblematic moments carry real consequences for resource allocation and for the social standing of communities tied to the events. At the same time, a focus on emblematic moments may eclipse the everyday coping strategies that sustained people. Many survivors emphasized practical care over heroic rhetoric. Personal letters speak in quiet, pragmatic language about sheltering, rationing, and mutual aid. Bringing such letters into public view can complicate heroic narratives, but can also restore agency to ordinary actors. Museums and memorial programs that incorporate these voices often produce more textured public understanding. Digital access initiatives expand reach, but also introduce curatorial decisions about what to digitize first. Those decisions become new moments of selection and exclusion. They continue the archival process and the politics of memory into the present. Memory is therefore ongoing, not a concluded record. New questions arise about how to teach contested episodes, how to honor victims without simplifying context, and how to balance national narratives with local histories. These questions require both documentary care and ethical reflection. They ask institutions to attend to marginal notes and to small anomalies as well as to headline documents. They ask communities to consider what recognition means in practical terms. The interplay between citizen memory and institutional memory shapes contemporary politics and civic life. As archives remain open and as family albums circulate more widely, debates about meaning continue. These debates may lead to new exhibitions, legislative acknowledgement, or educational reforms. They may also reveal further gaps in the record that require dedicated inquiry. The chapter closes on images that blend the public and private. A folded memorandum placed beside a wreath, a file stamp half visible beneath glass, a plain coat draped across a bench where a plaque now names an absent neighbor. These images do not resolve causality. They ask the viewer to consider memory as a contested resource, one that must be managed with care and humility. The final reflection points beyond the archive toward ongoing questions about how societies remember and about how future generations will inherit both documented truth and recorded ambiguity. The archive leaves us with images that are both precise and incomplete. Close-ups of folded memoranda sit beside wide photographs of crowded platforms. File stamps repeat like administrative echoes across many thin envelopes. Some stamped dates do not match contemporaneous notes, raising timing questions about when actions were recorded. Marginal annotations in hurried script sometimes contradict later typed summaries and official phrasing. These small mismatches might reflect delay, contested framing, or simple human error in stress. They suggest that institutional records both record action and shape how it will be remembered. Memory arrives in many registers: formal volumes, family albums, and recorded oral testimony. Each form emphasizes different aspects of risk, care, and everyday improvisation under strain. Uniform lapels in portrait photographs humanize authority without revealing the full chain of decision. Train platforms recur as sites of transit, rumor, and quiet farewells that later became ceremonial. Return points. International filings reshaped priorities and might have delayed urgent material support to neighborhoods. This layering of documents and lived experience resists tidy explanation or a single judgment. Future archival work could illuminate how marginal notes translated into practical choices on the ground. It could also explore who decided which papers were preserved, digitized, or left to fray in storage. Scholars and communities must consider preservation choices as moral and curatorial decisions. Digitization brings access, but also imposes new priorities and inevitable omissions. Exhibitions and textbooks shape how citizens will carry these episodes into civic memory. No single document captures the full texture of lived hardship and everyday courage. The archive asks us to listen, compare, and remain open to contradiction and nuance. These unresolved questions are not obstacles, but the beginnings of sustained inquiry. We turn now to continued searches for clarity, commemoration, and responsible stewardship of contested memory.